Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video we're going to be doing something a little bit different. A lot of people like to pick my brain about Savage encounters, what I'm most excited to see, especially at the start of an expansion when we have 2 whole weeks between normal mode and Savage mode. Now in those 2 weeks, I tend to look at these fights a lot and try to extrapolate strategies and theories about how the Savage modes will play out before they even release. A lot of this is pattern recognition, years of experience playing the game, and people just like to know how I think about these encounters. So I figured we'd take one of the current normal mode encounters and I'll break down what I see and what my experience in Final Fantasy XIV generally gets me to expect when the Savage fight comes around. Now, if you click this video and you don't want to actually be spoiled on any of the boss fights, then I would click away now. The entire video is just going to be me breaking down the first encounter in Pandemonium as Fidelis on normal and things that I immediately look at and go, okay, how's that going to work on Savage? So you've been warned, but from this point on, I'm going to swap the video over to actually having the visuals on the screen. Alright, so now that we actually have the encounter on the screen, we're just going to watch through a kill of the first circle of Pandemonium as Fidelis, and I'll break down things that, at an initial glance, I kind of can already guess how it'll be on Savage, just based on how they've designed things in the past. Now, that's not to say that this will be everything that encompasses Savage. There's usually some new mechanics that pop up in most of the encounters, but there, again, are little things that you can grab. We also have to keep in mind that because this is the first encounter, and it's the first encounter of the entire expansion, those are usually on the even easier side of predictions. So even though there will likely be some new stuff, the amount of things that are brand new are likely to be minimal, and we're mostly going to be seeing more difficult versions of the actual mechanics that we see in normal mode. Maybe some slightly stricter rule sets, or just basic things that seem like, oh, we have too much freedom here in normal mode, so they'll probably do something to limit that freedom to handle the mechanic in Savage mode. Really basic stuff. Right off the bat though, the arena, this isn't an arena I expect to change going into Savage. The walls are already deaf in normal, but there's always a possibility that the way certain mechanics interact with the wall could change, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now going into the first mechanic, Jailor's flail, this is just he either swings the chain right or left and then hits that side of his body with a 180-degree AoE. Now, as soon as I see anything that looks like it's reversible or it's possible to be one of two things, whether it be a donut AoE or a point blank AoE, a left or right swing like this, or anything where there's like two completely polar opposite mechanics that could possibly happen there, I assume both of them will be present in some capacity in Savage mode. When it comes to a left or right swing, I always assume in Savage that there's going to be a mechanic that just asks you to do both back to back. So in the case of Savage, I expect him to do the Jailor's flail, swing to the right, and then immediately with no charge up time swing to the left, so you have to pass through. And then they'll do something like that early in the fight, and then they'll add mechanics to that later on. Maybe a spread marker, maybe another swing going back the other way, or just overlaps with something else. Really basic stuff. So that's the majority of the first, 15% of the boss right here. There's really not a whole lot to say about that. Now, the next thing right after this is going to be a room-wide AoE. I do mostly just assume those will require more proper mitigation on Savage. Even being the first encounter and generally being easier, it's best to, recognize the name of that skill and kind of supermit it when you go into your first Savage pull. Now, I talk about recognizing the names of skills, and that's a really important thing when I'm looking at normal modes. When we have 2 weeks to extrapolate normal modes before we go in day one, 16, 18, 20 hours and try to just get as much progress as we can, if not outright get a clear, remembering the names of skills is one of the most important things that can save you a ton of time. When you're going through Savage after having 2 weeks of normal mode, people should take the time to learn what the skills names are. So if there is a donut AoE, a point blank AoE, a right swing, a left swing, some sort of attack that has an indicator on normal that you don't expect to have one on Savage, you need to recognize these mechanics by things other than AoE markers, other than things you can react to, so you can be proactive about handling the mechanics. Not super relevant on a first boss like this, but something that will be relevant throughout all of Savage and your experiences with it. Now this Pitiless flail, this is kind of a really basic mechanic where it's knocking one person back and then doing a split damage marker. Now there's a lot of directions a mechanic like this could go, including not actually having this trackable marker that we have. The most basic thing they could do is just mark a player and then turn, knock them away, and then do the split damage AoE. However, it's more likely that something like this will evolve and less so work the same or be multiplied. Like instead of doing 4 knockbacks into 4 split damage markers, which is of course a possibility, I'd expect something like this to be what we call a wild charge mechanic, where a tank has to stand closest to the boss and pop a cooldown in order to absorb shared damage, but the largest portion of it hitting the first person. So it becomes a tank mechanic into a party mechanic. So I expect this to be a split damage AoE line knockback on the targeted player, where the tank has to stand closest to the boss in the center of the AoE, and the party has to stack up immediately after in order to mitigate and heal through the damage that will come after. I do suspect it will still be a follow-up, but there could also be spread markers. It could be a stack marker into a spread marker right after, so you always have to play different possibilities like that in your head. It's just such a basic mechanic that has a lot of room to go in a lot of places, but you know that because it's the first encounter, it really can't go that many different places. Again, especially being the first encounter of the entire expansion. So there's another Jailor's Flail here. Again, I don't think I need to say anything more about what I expect from Jailor's Flail. Heavy Hand, it's a single target tank buster. I expect there to just be a tank swap here in Savage. Even being the first encounter, there's a chance it might not even have that, and it might just hit really hard. But more than likely, it is just going to put a tank debuff on the tank in Savage, and it will force a swap during the cast bar. Something really basic that you can just prepare for as long as you remember the name of the swap. It's also possible that there will just be a double Heavy Hand, where it will hit the first tank, and then it'll do a second follow-up swing, and that could require a double tank swap. That could just be the second hit the other tank needs to take, because the first tank actually has the physical vuln that would make them die. But it's also something that you're very likely to see tank invulns used on. There's nothing else so far to indicate that the tank invulns will be used on anything else, so you might actually just see those just used liberally on a mechanic like Heavy Hand. So moving on, we actually have 2 main mechanics that we need to extrapolate and talk about when it comes to an encounter like this. And the first one here is Intemperance. Now, this gives everyone in the raid an overloaded element of either fire or ice. If you get hit by that same element again, does a ton of damage, gives you a vuln stack, could possibly kill you. And so your goal is to basically swap your element here. So you can see I have ice, so I want to get hit by fire. That'll change my element to fire. Then I need to get hit by ice and then fire again. So my element needs to go back and forth. So we've had a ton of different instances of this mechanic in the past. And so there, again, immediately a ton of things come to mind. For example, the boss could swap your element in the middle of the mechanic. Even though you were fire and got hit by ice, maybe the boss reverses your element with another attack, and you actually need to get hit by 2 ices in a row. Which makes sense given the actual tower lineups here. You have double ices, a fire ice. There are some cases where with an element you can't solve this either all in one square or without running around to a bunch of different squares. So the boss actually adjusting your element with another attack in between would be a really basic way of trying to force you to do some very quick movement to track what the boss is doing while also tracking your debuff, while also tracking the arena itself. But again, really, really important to stress, first encounter. That's something that might be a little too advanced for the very first encounter in a raid tier, even though it's really not all that advanced at all. But what other things do we have here? What other context clues do we have? The biggest one is the cross AoE that goes through the room and divides it into 4 quadrants. Now in normal mode, if you get caught in between on that darker line, you insta-die. Okay, you know, for a normal mode that makes sense, but the odds of that being the only thing that line does in Savage, it's possible, but it's something worth thinking about. For example, Twice and Thrice Come Ruin are mechanics where if you screw up a mechanic too many times, you get a doom and you die a few seconds later. It's usually there to discourage you from doing mechanics wrong too many times, or to give you some leeway in screwing up once, maybe screwing up twice, but trying to make sure you don't just completely ignore mechanics overall. So it's possible that something like these lines would, maybe if you step over them, you get something like Twice or Thrice Come Ruin, and it tries to stop you from actually doing the mechanic too many times, just constantly hopping around. The problem with that is Twice or Thrice Come Ruin also usually reduce damage, and I don't think they'd force a damage down on you unless they have a different version of it planned for this. So what else could we think about the quadrants? Well, forced marches are a thing, or forcing you into multiple different quadrants in order to kind of make you understand the entire space, to have to come up with a pattern and come up with a plan. So a forced march would be a nice, easy way to do this. You know, maybe you need the northwest quadrant and you have a march left. and you have to take the march left into that northwest quadrant. They could double that up. You know, you do have to do 3 explosions here. Maybe they do 2 or 3 back-to-back forced marches. But then that's kind of annoying because forced marches don't allow you to attack a boss. So it's another way to move a character around the arena, or force them to think about how they need to move around the arena, while making sure that there's at least some punishment for mismanaging your movement. Knockbacks. It's entirely possible that as this mechanic plays out, each of these explosions that come from Intemperate Torment could knock you into another quadrant, and you need to carefully consider how that would work. Now, casters would be dreading this because it would be a lot of back-to-back-to-back knockbacks if they were to do something like that. So I think you're ultimately going to have free movement here, but the way in which you move is going to be heavily limited. There's either going to be stack markers, spread markers, or there's going to be a punishment for crossing over too many times and trying to get into the quadrant. Could just be really fast on Savage as well. But I like to play all those possibilities out, so if I see any of them play out during the actual encounter, then I know what to expect. Also, a big thing with this boss thematically is chains, shackles, so things that bind players together. It's entirely possible that there could be chains that force you to stand very close to a partner who has another element, which would force very tight positioning in the actual room. There could also be tethers that mean you have to be very far from a player at all times. So you may have players that need to stand in the northwest and southeast quadrants separately because they need to stand far enough apart from each other with these shackles, and then they need to both understand which direction to rotate in order to handle their various elemental mechanics. Then you could have players that need to stand together and do all of them at the same time. And with the way that the structure is actually split up, you could have 2 ice people tethered together, 2 fire people tethered together, and an ice and a fire tethered far away from each other on each person. So lots of possibilities here, one of the more interesting things to think about, but none of them all too difficult to get through, solve, and you'll probably see groups with a lot of experience figure that out in a single pull and never really have to mess around with it too much from that point on. But a very, very dynamic mechanic, or a possibility to be a dynamic mechanic, which is kind of a weird thing to say. Now, moving forward a little bit more, we have another room-wide AoE before we have the other mechanic that we really need to consider, in that of Shining Cells. Now, just like the other mechanic, there are lots of red flags, when it comes to the way that this mechanic is laid out. So first of all, the arena is very clearly split in a lot of different ways. For example, you can see that the arena is split perfectly down the middle. There are 8 sections, safe sections on the left side, and 8 sections on the right side. Big thing that I'm always looking for with arenas is if there's like standing here is dangerous and standing here is safe kinds of things, like alternating colors like this. I can only think that on Savage, each player needs to be in their own section, whether that be the fact that there are 8 different red sections and 8 different light sections, meaning nobody can stand on the same section together, or if half the room with its 8 has to stand each on a different one, while, like, I guess I'll let it play out a little bit so it makes a little bit more sense. So you can see here with this ether chain, all of the red sections are safe, and there's 8 different red sections. So I assume on Savage there's a mechanic that when ether chain goes off, every player in a section also explodes their section for a set amount of damage and a magic vulnerability up. And then, you know, if you have 2 players blowing up their own section with each other, they're going to kill each other automatically because of that magic vuln up. So that's just because of the symmetry, because there's exactly 8 of each of the possible safe spots that you can have. Anytime you see something like that in a normal or in a Savage, you need to immediately think about how the space is going to be used in the various different ways. There could be those spread sections, but there could also be stack sections where you have to stand on the same section as each other, or it's going to lead to a bad time. A lot of this kind of taken from experience with E4S back in Shadowbringers, where they have all these different kinds of arena manipulation to consider. But again, this is a much easier, or is going to be a much easier encounter, so don't expect it to get all too crazy. Another thing worth noticing about the arena is that it is split into a central circle and an outer ring, which both have 8 sections in them individually. So it's possible that you could need to get far away from the boss and use the sections that are in the outside ring, or that there's a donut AoE, you need to get close to the boss and use the inside ring. Now that would likely be paired with something else. Very likely that would be paired with one of the ether chain AoEs, or that would be paired with something else to make you more closely consider maybe 4 split damage markers, you know, 1 on each DPS, so you have to have DPS and healer or DPS and tank stack in each of them, and you need to be able to rotate in case it's going to be the fire spot safe or the light spot safe. And these are basic things. We see these kind of things in first encounter, so that seems like a pretty safe bet. There's also the possibility of spread mechanics, of what we call protean wave mechanics, something that targets every individual player with a conal AoE from the boss's location. Lots and lots of possibilities for this one, but I just expect this arena to play a more interesting role. Again, potentially doing the shackling mechanic I mentioned earlier, where it either chains players that need to stay close together or players that need to stay far apart. So a mix of those things on the arena. It's just about how they're going to control that. Will they make the chains any more dangerous? Will crossing over the chains too many times be dangerous? Probably not. But again, just given the whole shackling theme of this boss, I would like to see them play into that a little bit more. Because it's not really played in too much here, other than the boss swinging chains at you and there being chains on the arena. You know, there's not really too much else going on here. Now, unfortunately, there isn't really much else to talk about with this boss. I have a feeling this boss is going to be defeated by groups looking to claim world first in the raid tier. Honestly, probably within half an hour. I get that feeling from this boss. That it's going to be a very, very easy time. Now, one thing I am expecting is that Intemperance and the what the heck is this attack even called? I made the guide for it and I don't even remember what this actual attack is called. Ether flail, ether chain. I do expect there to shining cells. That's what it's called. I do expect a third mechanic that is Savage exclusive, that plays on some similar rules, but is still something that you wouldn't have experienced in normal mode. But given, again, the placement of being the first encounter, I don't expect it to be all too difficult. Now, is there anything else that would likely happen? Yeah, you're likely to see specific combinations of Shining Cell and Intemperance that only occur at certain set sections of the encounter. For example, Shining Cell's number 1 likely to have a different set of mechanics from Shining Cell's number 2, instead of it just repeating the same mechanic again. Same with Intemperance 1 versus Intemperance 2, and if there's a 3 or a 4, etc., etc. Maybe towards the end, repeating some things you've already seen and not really trying to remix them too much. But those are the kind of basic things we look at. We look at symmetry, we look at the arena, we look at the boss's theme, and we look at the things that would make this harder, but within reason to what the boss's placement is in the raid tier overall. Now, this analysis gets far deeper when we look at encounters that are further in the raid tier, because we have to take the gradually escalating difficulty into mind. So we start to be a little bit more masochistic about what we think they could possibly do going into those other encounters. So while in this video, I've specifically covered some really simple basics that you can likely expect to see from this first boss if you're going into Savage for the first time, I of course have done this exact same mental thought process for the other 3 bosses as well. And if you're interested, I will gladly make videos breaking down what I expect from the Savage versions of those bosses before the Savage tier itself actually comes out. On top of that, bear in mind, one interesting thing about this first raid tier is that we do have a 2-week period to extrapolate these kind of things from normal mode. However, in other raid tiers, at least up to this point, normal and Savage release at the same time. So in 6.2 and 6.4, it's most likely that they will do that, even though they have talked about adding a delay between normal and Savage, even in those 0.2 and 0.4 patches. If that's the case, these are the kind of things you have to get used to thinking about very quickly, because when you do that, you roll directly from finishing normal mode into doing Savage difficulty, and you have to have kind of process these things a little bit more closely. For situations like that in Savage Prog, very, very important to immediately snapshot any buffs or debuffs you get, so you can compare them with what your allies get, compare patterns, you know, who has this debuff, who has this, oh, is it 1 tank, 1 healer, 2 DPS? You're just constantly looking for patterns, you're constantly looking for clues. And that is almost always going to be prevalent when all 8 party members are alive and you have screenshots of every buff and debuff that people have gotten. When you are brand new to progging, do not try to solve something when you just have random markers. Hover over them, take a screenshot, and immediately tell everyone what it said. Compile it in a Discord, compile it in a in a Google Doc or something like that. These are all team building things that you can work on that can drastically improve the odds of you actually getting through in a somewhat timely fashion before anyone else has been have the time to come and tell you, hey, this is what you do, this is all you got to do. What other pieces of advice would I really pass along for someone looking to get into Savage for the first time? Practicing very set markers is very useful. Setting up spread positions that are tanks and healers on the cards and DPS on the inner cards, or potentially vice versa. And then also having groups of 4 that you're already accustomed with. If you have a partner, one of those healers or tanks, depending on the strategy, that you always partner up with for mechanics that split you into groups of 4, or just for you to work together with them on a part of the arena. Having that set in advance so that everyone's familiar with it is super useful for early prog, and something that the group I'm in has already done for bosses like this, even though they are only on the normal difficulty. But overall, it's just about having a curiosity to learn, to put a puzzle together. And as long as you have that curiosity, and as long as you're kind of over-analyzing it to a point where you kind of almost wish you wouldn't, then you're likely to come out with at least some result that is tangible, something that does stick, that you threw against the dartboard and actually managed to hit a bullseye. So I encourage you to do the same. Don't get too crazy. Don't just make stuff up out of thin air. But I do recommend trying to flex your creativity and think, what are ways that they can make this boss more difficult, but still fittingly for the place in the Savage Raid tier that it's going to be. But with that, that's going to be a wrap for this video. Again, if you would like me to extrapolate what I think about the other bosses and their Savage equivalents, let me know in the comment section of the video below. I got a week to kill before Savage comes out. Might as well make some good time with it. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see all of you in the next video. And until then, take care.